Berlin, September 1942. The Reichsmarschall reclined in his chair, a heavy crystal glass in one hand, a thick cigar in the other. The chandelier above cast sharp light across his medals, and the room filled with the smoke of triumph. Hermann Göring laughed loudly enough that even the adjutants in the hallway heard it. The reports on his desk claimed the Americans were ferrying bombers to Britain. He scoffed at the notion. To him, the United States was still an inexperienced nation, a land of farmers and assembly line laborers who could never challenge the seasoned Luftwaffe. "If a single enemy bomber reaches Berlin," Göring boasted, "you may call me Meyer." His officers joined in the laughter, eager to echo his arrogance. At that hour, Göring had numbers on his side. The Luftwaffe could muster thousands of fighters, many flown by aces hardened over Spain, Poland, and Russia. Berlin's defenses bristled with heavy flak batteries, notably the formidable 88mm guns, each capable of hurling shells into the stratosphere. Fighter bases encircled the capital like an armored ring. Against this stood the fledgling U.S. 8th Air Force in England, fewer than 100 operational heavy bombers. It looked like no contest. Berlin seemed untouchable, the Reich unbreakable. Yet the Reichsmarschall's laughter was already hollow. Across the Atlantic, unseen by him, the assembly lines of American industry were awakening with a force the world had never witnessed. At Boeing's Seattle plant, Consolidated San Diego facility, and Douglas's Tulsa line, riveters and welders were producing bombers in numbers that defied imagination. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, each bristling with guns and able to soar to 35,000 feet, were rolling out by the hundreds. By the time Göring mocked the idea of American bombing, the tide had already begun to rise in workshops and factories manned by ordinary citizens. He had another blind spot: American willingness to absorb losses. The Luftwaffe had grown up in the creed of decisive battle, where a single blow determined the outcome. The Americans were prepared for something different, attrition on a scale so vast it would grind down even the most veteran force. Göring's officers nodded to his jokes that evening, but already their pilots were dying over North Africa, and their factories were struggling to keep pace with demand. None of that mattered to the Reichsmarschall, who believed his own myth of invulnerability. Outside the headquarters, Berlin's streets were silent under blackout curtains. The distant wail of sirens drifted faintly, a warning most dismissed as another exercise. Civilians hurried through darkened avenues, believing Göring's promise that Berlin would never burn. Inside, the Reichsmarschall raised another toast, his voice booming with confidence. History would record his words, repeated endlessly after the war, not as triumph, but as bitter irony. For soon, the American bombers he mocked would come in waves so vast they would blot out the sun, and Berlin would burn night after night until laughter turned to silence. Over the flat, frozen plains of Kansas in early 1943, a new kind of army took shape. Captain Jack O'Donnell gripped the yoke of a B-17 Flying Fortress, the metal frame trembling under the roar of 4 engines. Frost condensed on the windows, cracking in tiny patterns across the glass, while the 10-man crew adjusted oxygen masks and checked the weight of bombs strapped into racks below. Formation flying was a relentless drill. Every bomber had to maintain precise distance and angle, each crew member a cog in a machine that promised both survival and destruction. The bitter cold and constant vibration were relentless teachers. Here, young men from farms and city streets learned the rules of air war. The Flying Fortress was a marvel of engineering. With 10.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, a maximum bomb load of 8,000 pounds, and a service ceiling exceeding 35,000 feet, the B-17 combined defensive firepower with endurance. The Norden bomb sight allowed precision the Luftwaffe did not expect, and twin-tail fins added stability during turbulent missions. Yet the machines were temperamental. Engines sometimes quit mid-flight, turrets froze, radios crackled in white noise. Crews learned to repair, improvise, and endure. Every rivet and bolt meant life or death when they crossed the Atlantic to challenge Berlin. Training bases like Kettering and MacDill were crucibles. Crews simulated flak bursts with pyrotechnics, practiced emergency bailouts, and logged endless hours learning to navigate by maps, compass, and dead reckoning. Flight instructors, veterans of early raids over Europe, barked orders that mixed technical jargon with practical survival. Check your port engine. Don't let the formation gap grow. Flak will find you first. Between drills, men swapped chewing gum for spare parts, pinned pictures of loved ones inside cockpit walls, and wrote letters that would never leave the base. They were ordinary citizens, turned instruments of war, learning the rhythm of an industrial war machine that was already reshaping the conflict. The scale of American production was staggering and unseen by the Germans. Factories across the Midwest and West Coast were churning out aircraft at unprecedented rates. Boeing in Seattle, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, and Consolidated in San Diego were producing bombers faster than Germany could deploy fighters. One day's output of B-24 Liberators at Willow Run alone could exceed Germany's total monthly production of similar aircraft. For the Luftwaffe, whose pilots were irreplaceable and fuel scarce, this sheer abundance was unknowable. Each bomber O'Donnell and his crew learned to fly represented not just a mission, but the cumulative weight of an industrial democracy at war. As the crew banked the fortress over snowfields, O'Donnell thought of the moment to come when these machines would fly across the Channel, carrying men and bombs into the skies of Germany. Göring's laughter in Berlin would soon be answered by the thunder of American engines. Each mile flown over Kansas, each rivet tightened in a factory, was a step closer to a capital that believed itself untouchable. And when the Americans finally reached Berlin, the city that had mocked them would feel the impossible weight of their industrial might. November 1943. The streets of Berlin were quiet, a muted gray under blackout curtains, but the air was tense with anticipation. 14-year-old Anna Kraus crouched beside her mother in the cramped apartment, pencil poised over her diary. Outside, her father hammered wooden boards over the windows, his hands trembling from cold and urgency. The wail of air raid sirens began softly, a mournful warning that would crescendo into chaos. From the rooftops, engines droned, faint at first, then louder as the night thickened with the approaching bombers. The Royal Air Force had launched the Battle of Berlin, a sustained series of night raids designed to destroy the city's industrial and civilian heart. For civilians like Anna, the abstract strategy of military planners translated into fire, smoke, and ash falling on familiar streets. Each morning, she emerged from the cellar to find chunks of brick where her school once stood, streets blocked with debris, and neighbors wandering aimlessly, carrying whatever possessions they could save. Fear was constant. Sleep was a luxury. The smell of burning timber, acrid and heavy, lingered long after the all-clear sounded. The scale of destruction was staggering. Over the winter of 1943 to 44, more than 30,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Berlin. Individual raids killed thousands. Tens of thousands were made homeless. The Luftwaffe could do little. Its night fighter pilots were few, its radar equipment limited, and flak defenses, though formidable, were scattered and often ineffective. The Reichsmarschall's promise to protect the capital rang hollow as smoke spiraled over familiar neighborhoods and firestorms consumed blocks of apartments in minutes. In one attack, 175,000 civilians were displaced in a single night, a testament to the relentless pressure being applied by the Allies. Inside the city, the human experience of war unfolded in intimate detail. Anna wrote of ash covering her fingertips, of the air tasting metallic, and of the eerie quiet when engines passed overhead. She noted the frightened expressions of neighbors, the exhaustion etched into every adult's face, the whispered prayers of children. Each diary entry recorded not only survival, but the impossible speed of destruction. Berlin, a city long considered invulnerable, was now repeatedly bruised and battered by forces it had underestimated. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic and the Channel, American industrial might continued unabated. Factories in the Midwest were producing more bombers than Germany could launch in a month. Every fortress or liberator that would someday scream over Berlin was born from hours of labor and precision, from rivets hammered in freezing hangars, from engineers who calculated each armament placement to maximize defensive firepower. Each sortie Anna would witness in the coming months represented thousands of hours of preparation and production, a tangible sign that her city's defenders were outnumbered not just in machines, but in resources, planning, and endurance. As she closed her diary for the night, Anna whispered the words her father had repeated. They said this could never happen. Outside, the first sparks of Berlin's destruction lit the sky. Smoke and fire coiled over the rooftops, and the distant thunder of explosions promised that the laughter of leaders like Göring would soon be silenced by the relentless, impossible scale of American air power. February 20th, 1944. Dawn broke over the English countryside with a brittle cold that seeped through flight jackets and gloves. On the tarmac at Bassingbourn Airfield, Captain Jack O'Donnell climbed into his B-17G, the aluminum skin cold beneath his gloves. Engines roared to life, their vibrations rattling every bolt and panel. Around him, hundreds of flying fortresses lined the runways, wings gleaming in the weak morning light. This was Operation Argument, known to the airmen as Big Week, a concentrated effort to shatter the Luftwaffe's fighter production. Every bomber in the formation carried more than 10,000 pounds of ordnance, enough to level entire factories. For the young crews, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. The mission unfolded over Germany's industrial heart. Factories in Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Leipzig were mapped with surgical precision. Each crew knew the target, the altitude, and the route. Flak batteries awaited, firing 88mm shells skyward like deadly fireworks. Enemy fighters would converge in waves, hoping to catch the lumbering fortresses unprotected. But this time, something had changed. Long-range P-51 Mustangs escorted the bombers, sweeping the skies to protect them from the Luftwaffe. O'Donnell could see contrails cutting across the horizon, the silver Mustangs patrolling like guardians above their fragile cargo of men and bombs. The Luftwaffe's response was ferocious, yet increasingly desperate. Over the week, German pilots lost more than 260 aircraft, many of them veteran aces, a loss Germany could ill afford. American bombers lost nearly 200 in the same period, yet the factories back home had already replaced them, churning out B-17 and B-24s at a pace that seemed impossible. Every sortie, every engagement, tested the doctrine of strategic bombing, relentless pressure on production, attrition of pilots, and disruption of morale. For the Americans, the losses were tragic, but anticipated. For the Germans, the scale of replacement was beyond comprehension. Inside the bomber, O'Donnell felt the rhythm of survival, adjusting flak jackets, checking gun positions, keeping the formation tight. Every decision mattered. Flak exploded nearby with a deafening crack, shaking the fuselage. Each pilot knew a single error could send them tumbling into flames. Yet above the roar, the sense of collective purpose was overwhelming. Outside, snow glinted on the German fields, indifferent to the human struggle unfolding above. By the time the formations returned to England, the scale of American resolve was evident. Factories would repair and replace, crews would train and return, and the Luftwaffe's best pilots had been thinned to unsustainable levels. Across the Channel, Berlin slept unaware that its capital was now vulnerable not by a single mission, but by the sheer weight of preparation, industrial might, and citizen soldier determination. Big Week had begun to reveal the impossible. The Americans could lose hundreds of bombers and still strike deeper, faster, and more decisively than Germany could defend. March 6, 1944. Berlin's morning was unusually clear, the sky a pale blue that belied the firestorm soon to descend. From the observation tower atop his headquarters, Hermann Göring watched the horizon with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Reports from radar stations indicated an armada of Allied bombers approaching, B-17 and B-24s, hundreds strong, escorted by the long-range P-51 Mustangs whose presence had only recently tipped the balance of aerial combat. The Americans he had once mocked were not only present but daring enough to challenge the heart of the Reich. Thousands of feet above the city, Captain Jack O'Donnell's B-17 formation carved a path across Germany. Turret gunners scanned the skies for Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, their fingers icy on triggers. Anti-aircraft flak erupted in deadly bursts, shaking aluminum panels and rattling every rivet. The Norden bomb site was locked on the designated industrial targets: rail yards, oil refineries, and aircraft factories. Every crew member understood the stakes. One slip, one miscalculation could send their flying fortress into the hands of history as wreckage. Inside Berlin, civilians scrambled. 14-year-old Anna Kraus clutched her mother's hand as the wail of sirens grew into a low, ominous drone. Her father dragged the family into the cellar, while smoke began to curl over the skyline. The city, long considered untouchable, now faced daylight raids with precision and relentlessness. Entire blocks were engulfed in flames within minutes, debris raining into the streets. Berliners realized in shock that the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee safety. Even Göring's vaunted 88mm flak guns, positioned strategically around the city, could not stop the swarms that moved with unprecedented coordination. The statistical reality was staggering. Approximately 730 American bombers were dispatched on this mission. 500 reached Berlin. 69 were lost to flak and fighters, a tragic but acceptable loss against a target that once seemed invulnerable. Each bomber represented thousands of hours of industrial labor and the collective effort of a nation fully mobilized. German pilots, even in greater numbers than before, were overwhelmed by the escorting Mustangs, whose speed, range, and firepower made interception almost impossible. Back on the tarmac in England, O'Donnell's crew exhaled once the bomb bay doors closed, adrenaline still thrumming. The airfield buzzed with maintenance crews repairing engines and loading bombs for the next sortie, a cycle that guaranteed relentless pressure. The raid demonstrated more than tactical skill. It exposed the limits of German endurance and revealed a truth Göring could not admit. His capital was vulnerable, his air force no longer dominant, and the American industrial machine had reached a scale he had once deemed impossible. That evening, as smoke rose over Berlin, Anna whispered in her diary, "They said it could never happen." But it has somewhere in the Reichsmarshal's headquarters, laughter had died, replaced by reports that would haunt him, the first glimpse of a strategic reality he had ignored, one that would repeat over and over until Berlin burned night after night. March 1944. A pale sun broke over the German countryside, glinting off the silver fuselage of P-51 Mustangs patrolling high above Berlin-bound bombers. Hauptmann Karl Fischer, scrambling in his Bf-109 from a base just outside the city, glimpsed the sleek Americans and felt an unfamiliar chill. He had flown countless sorties over France and the Eastern Front, but these Mustangs were different. Fast, relentless, and armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, they could dive from above, strike with deadly precision, and vanish before his fighters could respond. The air over Germany was no longer the Luftwaffe's domain. It belonged to the industrially backed, democratically fueled force that had been quietly growing across the Atlantic. Fischer's squadron attempted to intercept the formation of B-17 and B-24s that the Mustangs shielded. Flak pocked the sky in rhythmic bursts, shaking his cockpit and tearing leaves from nearby trees in the villages below. Engines roared, metal screeched, and smoke spiraled from those who were hit. Despite skill and experience, his pilots were outmatched by a combination of superior aircraft, protective formations, and the strategic brilliance of the 8th Air Force. Each bomber lost had a replacement waiting on the tarmac back in England, a concept Fisher could scarcely grasp. In 1 week, U.S. factories could produce more heavy bombers than Germany could deploy in an entire month. Inside the B-17 formation, Captain Jack O'Donnell focused on maintaining altitude and formation integrity. The Mustangs above provided cover, their long legs keeping the Luftwaffe at bay. The Norden bomb sight had locked onto the target, and the bombardier prepared to release the payload over Berlin's industrial heart. O'Donnell had felt fear, adrenaline, and awe in equal measure. Fear of flak, adrenaline from evasive maneuvers, awe at the scale of coordination that allowed hundreds of bombers to arrive unscathed with fighter escort. Meanwhile, civilians like Anna Kraus looked skyward from makeshift shelters. She could hear the rumble of engines and the whine of machine guns, feel the city tremble under distant explosions. Berliners began to comprehend the impossibility of resistance. Factories could be rebuilt, streets could be cleared, but the air above, once thought inviolate, was now patrolled by a force that could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. The scale of American production and technological superiority was becoming painfully visible, even from the cellar windows of a frightened 14-year-old. By the time Fisher returned to base, only a fraction of his squadron remained. Engines smoking, fuel low, morale shattered, he realized what the Americans already understood. Air power, combined with industrial abundance and innovation, could not be defeated by courage alone. The P-51's range, speed, and firepower, coupled with relentless bomber formations, had made the Luftwaffe's best defenses insufficient. One young fighter pilot whispered, "It is impossible, but it is happening," encapsulating the bitter truth now sinking into Germany's airmen. As the formation returned to England, engines winding down and crews shivering, O'Donnell looked out over the North Sea. The first Mustang escorts had completed their mission. From below, Berlin would burn. Above, the shadow of democracy's industrial might stretched across the continent, and the Reich realized too late that its arrogance had met an impossible reality. Inside Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, the smell of oil and hot metal filled the air, a constant reminder that victory began on the ground. Riveters, welders, and engineers moved with disciplined precision, assembling B-24 Liberators in a rhythm that seemed impossible to outsiders. One bomber rolled off the line every hour, each a fully armed 8-gun fortress, with the capacity to carry 10,000 pounds of bombs. For Carl Fischer and the Luftwaffe, this output would have seemed absurd. One single plant in Michigan could outproduce entire German factories in a month, a stark illustration of the industrial democracy behind the American war effort. Captain Jack O'Donnell and his crew had no idea of the exact numbers, but they felt the effects. Training bases were never short of planes. Replacements arrived faster than missions could be flown. Every sortie that returned damaged or intact was a testament to the factories that had built it. Engines, guns, and oxygen systems, each component crafted, inspected, and delivered by a workforce that included women, minorities, and teenagers, all working in shifts that blurred night and day, created an unbroken chain from raw materials to strategic advantage. These were not just machines. They were instruments of national will, forged in steel and human determination. Back in Berlin, Hauptmann Fischer began to grasp the impossibility of resistance. His pilots flew sorties without enough fuel, spare parts, or replacement aircraft. Even when they managed to shoot down American bombers, the next wave arrived within days, fully crewed and better armed. German factories struggled to repair damaged planes, while American plants churned out dozens more each day. For every Bf-10-9 destroyed, 3 bombers returned to the skies, escorted by Mustangs that rendered interception nearly futile. The contrast between abundance and scarcity became painfully clear. The Americans could endure losses that Germany could never replace. Strategists in Washington, London, and Rome monitored the production charts, recognizing the effect of sheer numbers on morale and attrition. General Karl Spaatz noted that losses in Big Week were tragic yet sustainable, while Germany's most experienced pilots were being thinned at an unsustainable rate. One could see the domino effect. Fewer pilots meant fewer intercepts, which meant more bombers reaching targets, which further crippled production. The industrial engine in the Midwest and West Coast became a weapon as decisive as the guns and bombs it produced. The rhythm inside Willow Run, metal clanging, workers calling corrections, assembly lines humming, mirrored the tempo of the skies. O'Donnell, sitting in a B 24 days later, reflected on the strange symbiosis. Human ingenuity feeding machinery, machinery enabling human heroism, all orchestrated across thousands of miles to strike at the heart of the Reich. The impossible statistic was clear. In one day, Willow Run could produce more bombers than Germany could deploy in an entire month. One city, one factory, one nation's industrial might had begun to render arrogance and past victories irrelevant. As O'Donnell's bomber lifted off for another mission, engines screaming over the snowfields of England, the shadow of factories stretched across the Atlantic. Every rivet, every engine, every gun contributed to a tide that would overwhelm Berlin. The war, once considered balanced, was tipping irrevocably toward those who could combine human sacrifice with industrial abundance, and the Reich was beginning to understand the price of underestimating a democracy at war. February 3rd, 1945. A pall of smoke hung low over Berlin as dawn broke, tinged with orange from the fires that still raged across shattered neighborhoods. 14-year-old Anna Kraus pressed herself against the cellar wall, counting the seconds between the distant thunder of explosions and the rumble of engines overhead. The city had learned to recognize the sound of American bombers, the whine of their engines signaling both destruction and inevitability. She held her mother's hand, trying to steady herself against the trembling wooden floor as distant flames illuminated the night sky beyond the barricaded windows. Above, Captain Jack O'Donnell's B-17 formation approached Berlin, escorted by P-51 Mustangs slicing through the thin morning air. The bombers had been loaded with thousands of pounds of ordnance, precisely calculated to destroy rail yards, factories, and depots essential to the Reich's faltering war effort. Flak batteries popped along the outskirts of the city, each shell exploding like a deadly firework. But the defensive fire could not prevent hundreds of American aircraft from reaching their targets. Smoke rose in spirals, curling above rooftops that had not yet collapsed. The Luftwaffe, depleted and demoralized, offered scattered resistance, often too late to matter. The scale of destruction was staggering. Over 1,000 bombers dropped nearly 2,300 tons of bombs in a single day, leveling industrial complexes and sparking firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Tens of thousands were rendered homeless, and the surviving population scrambled through streets littered with brick and ash. Anna watched from the cellar as rooftops disappeared beneath smoke and flame, feeling both awe and terror. The once proud capital, the seat of Göring's arrogance, was now a city in ruins, and she understood that the war had reached her doorstep in ways adults had once assured her were impossible. In England, O'Donnell and his crew felt the weight of the mission. Every bomber that reached Berlin represented a vast network of industrial power. Engines from Detroit, rivets from Pittsburgh, electronics from Boston, bombs from Ohio. The scale of production was almost unimaginable. German factories struggled to replace damaged aircraft and parts. American plants, meanwhile, produced dozens of bombers and fighters each day. One day's output of B-24 Liberators at Willow Run alone exceeded Germany's monthly aircraft production. The Americans could endure losses that would have crushed any other nation, their industrial engine relentless and unforgiving. The human perspective intertwined with strategic realities. Anna's diary recorded smoke, the smell of burning timber, and the constant tremor underfoot. Fischer's depleted Luftwaffe pilots returned to bases with empty hangars, aware that they were fighting an enemy who could replace losses faster than Germany could deploy them. O'Donnell and his crew, exhausted yet alive, knew they had participated in a mission that reshaped the balance of air power. The combination of American industrial might, tactical planning, and individual courage had rendered Berlin vulnerable in a way previously unthinkable. As Anna traced another ash-marked street with her eyes, she whispered, "They said it could never happen." Above, the engines of returning bombers faded into the horizon, carrying the weight of destruction and the promise of more to come. Berlin had begun to burn night after night, and the Reich's leaders could no longer ignore the impossible reality of America's airborne industrial dominance. March 15, 1945. Over the Ruhr Valley, the sky was eerily quiet, a silence broken only by the distant roar of returning Allied bombers. Hauptmann Karl Fischer leaned against the cockpit frame of his battered Bf-109, watching the horizon with grim resignation. Entire squadrons had been grounded, aircraft destroyed or out of fuel, and replacements were scarce. German airfields, once bustling with activity, now sat in near desertion, hangars empty and crumbling under the weight of missed repairs. The Luftwaffe had reached the limits of endurance. Even the bravest pilots knew the truth. The Americans would keep coming, and Germany could no longer contest the skies with meaningful force. Far below, the factories and rail yards that had supported German industry were reduced to smoldering ruins. The Americans had perfected a system of cumulative destruction. Each raid targeted not only the physical plant, but also supply lines, repair depots, and transportation networks. Every sortie delivered precise devastation, while crews rotated tirelessly, confident in the knowledge that new aircraft and replacement crews awaited them. One day's production of American bombers exceeded what Germany could muster in an entire month. Fighter losses that once would have been catastrophic were now absorbable. The industrial democracy of the United States had transformed material abundance into a decisive weapon. In Berlin, civilians bore witness to the consequences. 14-year-old Anna Kraus had grown accustomed to the sound of engines, the smell of smoke, and the trembling of the ground beneath her feet. Her diary entries recorded not just fear, but realization. The city she had once considered invincible was now a landscape of skeletal buildings, scorched streets, and displaced families. Each raid reinforced the growing truth among ordinary Germans. The war was no longer winnable by courage or tactical skill alone. The Americans had the resources, the technology, and the industrial muscle to sustain continuous pressure, turning attrition into inevitability. Captain Jack O'Donnell reflected the human side of this vast system. Each mission required meticulous planning, precise flying, and unflinching courage. Yet the success of their operations was inseparable from the factories, the assembly lines, and the thousands of civilians who made each bomber possible. The scale was dizzying. Engines poured out of Detroit plants, bombs from Ohio depots, P-51 Mustangs escorting formations that numbered hundreds, each aircraft representing hundreds of hours of labor and innovation. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German engineering, was overwhelmed by not just skill, but sheer abundance. By mid-March, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. German air resistance had thinned to near irrelevance, allowing Allied bombers to strike with near impunity. Entire industrial regions were paralyzed, supply chains fractured, and the morale of pilots and civilians alike had begun to crumble. The empty skies above the Reich symbolized the tipping point. American industrial power, combined with disciplined execution and technological superiority, had broken the German ability to contest its own airspace. One by one, the impossible statistics had become reality. Factories could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed. Crews rotated endlessly, and the tide of destruction would continue until the Reich's defeat was complete. As O'Donnell's formation crossed back over the North Sea, engines winding down in the fading light, he glimpsed Berlin on the horizon, smoke still rising from a city that had once seemed untouchable. The emptiness of the skies above it told a story of irreversible momentum, the triumph of industrial democracy over totalitarian arrogance, and the inevitability of American victory. April 20th, 1945. Over Berlin, The sky was a tapestry of smoke and fire, the remnants of a city that had once epitomized Nazi power. Captain Jack O'Donnell climbed into his B-17 for one of the final sorties over the German capital. Engines roared, vibrating through every rivet and panel, a mechanical heartbeat connecting men and machines to a vast industrial network that spanned continents. Below, ruined streets and collapsed rooftops glimmered in the morning light, evidence of months of relentless bombing. For civilians like Anna Kraus, the world had narrowed to survival: cellar walls, rationed food, and the distant drone of American bombers. The strategic calculus was unmistakable. Over 40,000 tons of bombs had been dropped on Berlin alone, and more than 100,000 civilians displaced. The Luftwaffe, depleted and demoralized, struggled to field even skeletal formations. One squadron might muster 5 or 6 aircraft, pilots exhausted or killed, fuel scarce. In contrast, the Americans could sustain hundreds of bombers in continuous operations, each sortie supported by factories capable of producing more in a single day than Germany could in a month. The scale of replacement was impossible to ignore, a fact Göring would have privately acknowledged if he had confronted reality. Inside O'Donnell's formation, the crew understood the human and mechanical symbiosis that made this possible. Turret gunners scanned the skies while the bombardier adjusted the Norden sight, synchronized to targets across the industrial heart of the Reich. Flight engineers monitored engines, adjusted fuel mixtures, and calculated performance margins. Every part of the mission relied on the precise functioning of a system that extended from assembly lines in Detroit and Seattle to runways in England. Industrial might had become a weapon of war as decisive as any bomber gun or fighter escort. On the ground, Anna watched as columns of smoke marked the latest strikes. Families scavenged among rubble, yet the rhythm of survival persisted. Every destroyed factory or rail line could be replaced in weeks by American output. German industry could not match the speed or scale of the Allies. The psychological impact was profound. Even seasoned German officers realized that the war was being lost, not through courage or strategy, but through overwhelming material and organizational advantage. As the formation crossed back over the North Sea, the sun glinting off aluminum skins, O'Donnell reflected on the human cost. Hundreds of crew members had been killed, thousands of civilians displaced, yet the mission's success was undeniable. The final sortie was not just a bombing mission. It was a testament to the impossible scale of American warfighting capacity, the inexorable logic of production, and the courage of ordinary citizens transformed into instruments of history. May 1st, 1945. In London, reports compiled by Allied intelligence began to quantify the scale of what had been accomplished. Over the course of 1943 to 1945, the U.S. 8th Air Force had flown more than 350,000 sorties, dropping over 1.6 million tons of bombs on German industry, transportation, and urban centers. Casualty ratios were staggering. For every American airman lost in strategic bombing, Germany lost scores of pilots, hundreds of aircraft, and untold industrial capacity. 1 month at Willow Run alone could replace more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could launch in an entire year, a statistic that seemed impossible but was verified in official production reports. Captain O'Donnell, now back on English soil, studied the debriefing charts. B-17S and B-24s had destroyed aircraft factories, oil refineries, and rail hubs with precision that defied earlier skepticism. Mustangs had extended the reach of every bomber mission, neutralizing the Luftwaffe's advantage in speed and experience. For each German pilot lost, one could trace the effect cascading through multiple sectors: fewer interceptions, more bombers reaching targets, a compounding effect of attrition that Germany could never overcome. The numbers revealed what the human eye alone could not: a war being won not only by heroism, but by the sheer capacity of a democratic industrial system to outproduce and outfight a totalitarian opponent. In Berlin, Anna Kraus scribbled in her diary one final time, tallying the city's devastation as best she could. Tens of thousands of homes leveled, entire neighborhoods turned to ash, industry crippled beyond repair. These figures, when paired with American production data, told a story that Göring's laughter could never have imagined. One city, one factory, one nation's workforce had created an output so overwhelming it rendered German resistance futile. The paradox was clear. The more the Reich fought, the more effective the American industrial and tactical system became. For historians later, the statistics underscored an uncomfortable truth. Germany's defeat was not solely the result of battlefield genius or individual heroics. It was an inevitable outcome of systemic imbalance. One American plane lost could be replaced in hours. German losses accumulated like compound interest against a declining account. The numerical dominance of the Allies, aircraft, fuel, ordnance, and trained personnel, translated directly into strategic and tactical victory. For O'Donnell, the debriefings confirmed what crews already felt. The war had been won long before the final bombs fell, by the marriage of ingenuity, courage, and industrial abundance. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe had been declared. Streets once darkened by blackout curtains now filled with cheers, but the shadow of the war remained in Berlin's skeletal ruins and the memories of those who had survived. Anna Kraus walked past charred buildings, noting the absence of laughter that once echoed from the Reich's capital. She understood finally the full weight of what had occurred. The Reich's industrial and military arrogance had been confronted by a nation that had transformed everyday citizens into instruments of extraordinary power. Captain Jack O'Donnell reflected on his own journey from the snowfields of Kansas to the burning skies of Berlin. Each sortie had been a step in a vast chain of human and mechanical effort, a demonstration of industrial democracy in motion. The ability to replace hundreds of bombers, to train crews continuously, and to innovate faster than the enemy could react had been decisive. The Mustangs, the Flying Fortresses, the B-24 Liberators, all were symbols of a nation's capacity to harness abundance as a weapon of war. Strategically, the lessons were undeniable. Germany's loss of air superiority had triggered cascading consequences, crippled logistics, delayed reinforcements, and the eventual collapse of industrial centers that could not recover. American statistics, planes produced, sorties flown, tons of bombs dropped, told a story more compelling than any battlefield report. Sheer industrial power, coupled with tactical precision and individual courage, could determine the fate of nations. Göring's laughter, once echoing through Berlin, had been replaced by the inexorable reality of fire and ash. For historians and veterans alike, the legacy was twofold. It honored the courage and sacrifice of those who flew, built, and maintained the machinery of war, and it celebrated the systemic superiority that made their efforts decisive. The story of Berlin's destruction was not one of chance. It was the outcome of an integrated force: men, machines, factories, and strategy, operating at a scale that seemed impossible even to contemporary observers. Democracy had wielded abundance, coordination, and innovation as instruments of liberation, and the results had reshaped the modern world. As O'Donnell gazed over the remnants of Berlin one last time, he understood that the victory extended beyond statistics or missions. It was a testament to human will, industrial might, and collective ingenuity. The thunder of American bombers had silenced tyranny, and the world would inherit a lesson in the power of preparation, sacrifice, and the impossible realized through the marriage of courage and production. Berlin's ashes bore witness to a truth that would endure. Abundance, when mobilized with purpose, could outmatch any tyranny.